Ukraine is preparing for a new Russian offensive. Western media are full of such headlines. The statements about Russian offensive are heard from the Ukrainian authorities. The dates are different, but very close. Experts predict that Moscow can organize a new attack before February 24, or at least before Ukraine receives Western tanks and other weapons. And it's important to understand how real is the threat, what can Russia do, what plan will be implemented, and what will all this lead to at the front line. I'm Oleksii Matsuka, and right now we will talk about everything in detail. To begin with, it's important to understand the timing. And here there is a forecast published by the Financial Times, which writes in the following 10 days, Russia may launch a large-scale offensive in Ukraine. Kyiv has very reliable information about such intentions. In its forecasts, the publication refers to Ukrainian officials and the military.
Ukrainian forces are bracing for an imminent large-scale attack by Russian troops as the Kremlin seeks to regain the initiative in the war and seize the rest of the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. From the Financial Times publication.
The media call the western part of Lugansk region in the area of Crimea and Liman a likely place for a new Russian attack. They write that Russia has been gathering troops there for several weeks. The fact that an attack is possible in the Lugansk region in the coming weeks is also confirmed by the head of the military administration, Sergei Haidai. He says that in this direction Moscow is drawing up more and more reserves, bringing more and more equipment, which is partially hidden in forest plantations. Russian troops are bringing ammunition, but saving them, obviously preparing for a full-scale offensive. But according to Haidai, the offensive, if it happens, will be after February 15, because Russia will need the next 10 days to gather reserves.
The 2 months training of the newly mobilized is already coming to an end, but it still takes 2 weeks to bring them from different bases in Russia and Belarus. After February the 15th, you can expect the offensive at any time. Sergei Haidai, head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration.
Moscow is also building up its troops in the south of the Donetsk region, transferring additional forces to the villages around Mariupol. All this is probably done in a hurry, changing plans on the go due to recent decisions on the supply of new weapons to Kyiv.
An attack now could allow Russia to strike before Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles bolster Ukraine's offensive capability. From the Financial Times publication.
Yes, not all the necessary equipment managed to arrive before February, but Kyiv has something to hold back the onslaught, says the Ukrainian defense minister. And he makes his prediction: there will be an offensive, and most likely it will happen before the anniversary of full-scale invasion.
We expect a Russian offensive in February. It doesn't make much sense from a military point of view, but Russians love symbolism. We are ready. We are accumulating reserves. We are working with the training of personnel. We do not see that the Russians were fully prepared for the offensive, but last time they weren't too ready either and got hit in the teeth. Oleksii Reznikov, Minister of Defense of Ukraine.
Doing something preciously on the anniversary of the start of a full-scale war is an expected move that Moscow can take. After all, now in Russian kitchens they are increasingly talking about losses, and on the air there are fewer reasons for joy. A year of war will make many wonder what was it for, what did the Kremlin achieve, and an offensive would change the information agenda.
According to Ukrainian military intelligence, Putin gave the order to seize the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions by March. Andriy Chernyak, representative of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine.
Kyiv is preparing and appears to be taking the threat seriously. This can also be evidenced by the decision to leave the current Minister of Defense Reznikov in his chair. It's logical to assume that in conditions when an offensive is about to begin at the front line, it's not the time to change anything in the military department. And since everything is serious, it's important to understand how can everything happen, where to expect the offensive of Russia. The fact that Russia can attack from all sides, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council suggested. Western experts have different versions and assumptions, and here it's interesting to look at the map and understand all the versions. The fact that Russia will go on the offensive only in the east of Ukraine and will be limited to the territories of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, analyst Mikhail Kaufman is sure. An expert from the American Center for Naval Analysis believes that Russia simply does not have enough strength and resources for more. Mobilization allowed Moscow to increase the number of soldiers at the front. Equipment continues to come from warehouses, but the quality of these new units remains low.
In my opinion, the Donbass remains the main target of Russian military operations, so Russia's offensive actions will be aimed at capturing this territory. Michael Kaufman, expert of the American Center for Naval Analysis.
According to the forecast of the military analyst, an attack is possible along the Svatovo-Kremenная line towards Kupiansk and Liman, as well as in the south of Donetsk region in the Ugledar region. And here, what is important, he notes, the Russians have been advancing on Ugledar for some time and does not exclude that the big offensive expected by everyone has in fact already begun. It's there. It's just that the stage of the war is not yet regarded in this way. British intelligence is also inclined to this version. The British Ministry of Defense believes that Russia has been trying to resume major offensive operation since the beginning of January. At the same time, they predict that the Russians will limit themselves to capturing the part of the Donbass region that remains under the control of Ukraine, and here is why.
Russian forces were able to retake only a few hundred meters of territory in a week. This is almost certainly due to the fact that Russia now lacks the ammunition and maneuver units needed for their successful offensive. From the forecast of the British intelligence,
Zaporizhia and the region is yet another possible point on the offensive map. This is the third direction from which an attack by the Russian army is possible, according to Ukrainian military intelligence.
We determined that Russian offensives could be in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and possibly also in Zaporizhia. At the same time, in the Kherson region and in the Crimea, Russian troops will conduct defense. Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine.
According to the advisor of the mayor of Mariupol, Pyotr Andryushenko, Russia is actively deploying military personnel to the Mariupol area. In the last week alone, up to 15,000 occupants arrived. In general, their number in that area has already reached 30,000. The final touch of this transfer is called the entry of new unit of Kadyrovets, about 2,000 or 3,000 people, into one of the coastal villages, and this, according to Andryushenko, is similar to the information of a detachment for a potential offensive. And the military themselves, in conversations with local residents, let slip that they are preparing an attack on Ugledar and Zaporizhia. But analysts at the American Institute for the Study of War have doubts about the success of the Russians in the Zaporizhia direction.
Decisive Russian offensive operations are unlikely to target the city of Zaporizhia from the western Donetsk-Zaporizhia front line, as the Russian military continues to prepare for an offensive in the western part of the Luhansk region. Russia is concentrating troops and military equipment for a decisive offensive in the west of the Luhansk region and at the Bakhmut districts. From the ISW report.
A possible attack by Belarus on Kiev is another version. The main sign of the preparation of such operations should be the formation of offensive groupings. But the Minister of Defense of Ukraine assures that the situation in Belarus has not changed significantly lately. The Ministry of Defense doesn't record the formed offensive groups capable of advancing on Kiev from the territory of Belarus. Yes, Russia continues to rotate its troops in Belarus. It transfers new military from trainings and those who have already completed it returning to Russia to go to the front line from there. But total number of Russians military in Belarus, according to the Ministry of Defense, is 12,000. According to the Ukrainian Border Guard Service, and even less, about 9,000 people.
Near our border, we do not note the movement of either military equipment or the personnel of these units. Andriy Demchenko, Speaker of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine.
And here it's important to clearly understand the imaginary seizure of which territories for the Russians is of strategic military importance and which ones are only psychological or propaganda. United States military analysts say that from a military point of view, neither the capture of Bakhmut, neighboring Siversk, even if they happen, will be of strategic importance for this war.
Even the capture of Bakhmut will do little for the Russians. The Ukrainians have built good defense lines further, on the outskirts of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, and Russia can no longer support the offensive from the east with strikes from the north and south. Michael Kaufman, expert of the American Center for Naval Analysis.
And the advance of the Russians to the west from Crimea and Svatova also will not bring a turning point at the front line, and the Pentagon is sure. They predict, I will quote, that Russia can really take control of secondary settlements that are not decisive importance for the advancement of its troops. Positional battles can continue there for many months, but they have no strategic military significance, and Russians' losses in this case will be huge.
Russia's strategy is to push its forces forward by trying to play additional territorial games. Russia is not fighting the way our allied forces or the Ukrainians are fighting. They are really throwing their forces, throwing their people into the meat grinder, ignoring the very high casualties they are facing. Laura Cooper, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense.
And here is the section that is important from a military point of view and which is worth paying attention to according to experts. This is the southern front line passing through the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. This is a land corridor to the Crimea and to Kherson region. And for Russia, the strategic task is to prevent the armed forces of Ukraine from cutting it, reaching the Sea of Azov and the borders with Crimea. But with the new weapons, Ukraine will be quite capable of doing this, and such scenarios have been voiced.
Given that our foreign partners are supplying us with new types of weapons, the so-called land corridor to Crimea is, of course, not safe. Ukraine will strike at the positions of the Russians throughout the occupied territory. Andriy Chernyak, representative of Main Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine.
And Moscow understands this. Therefore, in order to move the front line away from the land corridor, the Russians can go ahead and launch the first offensive in this sector. In addition, to pull the main forces of the armed forces of Ukraine from the south, they may begin to move in other directions to Kyiv or Kharkiv. Whether Russia will follow this scenario is not yet clear, but the information of offensive groups in Belarus, in the Chernigov or Kharkiv directions, will definitely signal such a decision. And since the Ukrainian military does not have such information today, Russian forces are most likely still concentrating on conducting offensive operations in the east and not in the south. Although this is a war and the situation can change at any moment. But not only fast deliveries of tanks and long-range munitions to Ukraine are forcing Russia to hurry. The onset of spring is the factor that can affect the course of the war in the near future.
Russian military commanders appear to be in a hurry to launch a decisive offensive ahead of the arrival of Western military assistance and the spring season of bad weather in Ukraine. From the ISW report.
It was the spring weather factor that prevented Russians' mechanized maneuvers last year, military experts say. But will the weather factor also prevent the armed forces of Ukraine from going on the offensive? After all, if you remember, it was planned a big offensive. In any case, both the head of military intelligence Budanov and US Department of State official, the same Victoria Nuland, stated this. But until the promised Western weapons arrive in full, it's unlikely that the offensive will be peddled, the US are sure.
For the Ukrainians, it would probably be more profitable to wait for the Russian offensive, hold it back, let it fizzle out, and then move forward on their own. The promised tanks and other Western equipment will not arrive by this time in the required quantity, but the Ukrainian command will at least be sure that the losses in the offensive will be replenished later. Michael Kaufman, expert at the US Center for Naval Analysis.
Summing up, the likelihood of a Russian attack is really high, but the readiness of Moscow raises serious doubts. For example, analytics from the Institute for the Study of War shows that the Russian army is not strong enough to defeat Ukrainian troops in the east of Ukraine and captured more than 11,000 square kilometers of the Donetsk region. The Pentagon does not see the potential for a new Russian offensive either, but they said that Russians' ability to wage a lone war should not be underestimated either. And so the coming weeks will not be a turning point, but they can become really important. Well, how everything will be, I will definitely tell you in one of the videos. Don't miss the latest releases 3 times a week on this channel, and see you.